with her, what's actually her first book, but I think newly out in English now. First novel. She's written 2 novels, right?
Yes, and the second one will be out in English in exactly next year, actually.
Exactly next year. So Florence is a novelist. She's also the literary critic or editor for Le Monde in France. And in that capacity, she's had the delightful opportunity to meet writers around the world, including some of the most iconic and great writers of our time. And she's written 2 amazing books about them, which are sort of these miniature portraits of these authors and her conversations with them. Name anybody, she's sort of talked to all of them. Vargas Llosa, Milan Kundera, Cecil Boone, the list just goes on. Writers from Asia, Europe, all the continents. And then also a book devoted to English writers. So what we'll do today is we'll talk a little bit about her new book, which is just out, The Gift, but also her other book about the criticism she's written, and through that a discussion of literature and its trends around the world and the process of writing. So I'd like to start, Florence, by got a few notes that I lose track of things we can talk about. Florence actually went to one of the biggest, most prestigious business schools in Europe, and then had a full-fledged career as a very serious businesswoman, including a big chunk of time in America. And then she wrote a book called I Apologize for Having Done an MBA. and officially quit the business life to become a literary critic and writer. So I want to start, Florence, by asking, reading your fiction, reading your criticism, it's clear to me that literature is or must have been a very early or original passion for you. And yet you've taken a very circuitous route in coming to it. But why the detour? How does that happen, or why?
That's right. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone here, and you in particular, Annelies, for putting me on the grill. And thanks to the organizers, of course. I'm very happy to be here in Lahore. How did I quit my job as a financial analyst to become a literary critic for Le Monde? Actually, it's true that literature and art in general has always been very important to me since childhood. But then I went to this business school, which is one of the best in Europe. It's called HEC anyway. And because it was the 80s and that it was very trendy or fashionable, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I knew that art was important to me, but I was too shy to admit that I wanted to be a writer or write as a professional journalist. So I sort of cowardly take this route that led me to business and to financial analysis. It was an American corporation based in Minneapolis. And my job was, of course, not surprisingly, to maximize profit. And I would report to the American management, top management, every month. And every month the question was the same. It was, well, Florence, that's good, but listen, how can we make more profit? So after a while I was a bit tired and disappointed because it was so obvious and so, it was such a caricature. I couldn't believe my ears. And then there was another thing. Each time I was meant to fire somebody, they would applaud and say that it was such a great victory. So I thought that, my God, I couldn't do, well, first of all, I think there was something wrong in the system. And then I thought that I couldn't go on doing this for my entire life. It's not that it was not interesting. I mean, I learned a few techniques which, of course, are very useful, especially in the modern world. And I'm not at all saying that it's totally meaningless. It's just that I would have liked to find another way of doing business in a more So that's why I wrote this book that you mentioned. It's actually called I Went to Business School and I Apologize. And this led me to the subcontinent, in fact, and to your country, Bangladesh, where I met Yunus, the Nobel Prize for Peace. And I went to visit the Grameen Danone factory in Bogora, which is meant to produce yogurts enriched with nutrients for children who do not have enough to eat or do not eat the right things. And this to me was an interesting path that could lead us today to practicing business in a more meaningful or clever way.
So,
and then I quit.
And then you quit. So having quit, you went into writing, but you didn't come into writing fiction right away. I mean, you were still deferring this deeper passion, and I find that phenomenon interesting because I feel like we live in an age where we are told, or certainly the next generation, our children are told, you can be anything. Everybody's told everybody can be everything. We live in an age when that's told to everybody, and I've recently seen studies actually where they've sort of studied and verified that the rate of narcissism is higher now than at any time in modern history. And I think the more sort of nurturing our culture gets, instead of making us more compassionate and empathetic to other people, it's actually having the effect of making us more self-regarding. And at this time, everybody believes they can be an artist, this and that and the other. And I do believe that that's true if you have that passion. But along with that passion, you kind of need a tremendous amount of hard work and practice and self-criticism and sort of really holding yourself up to a standard and saying, is this good enough? And I see a lot of phenomenon where people are just putting it out because I felt this, therefore it should be out there. Just because you felt it, it's still not necessarily fit for public consumption. And in your case, you kind of went the opposite route where you kept doubting yourself and waiting and practicing and learning and educating. So I want to come to this second phase of education, which was not the point of it, but it turned into a kind of education for you, as you've written about, in meeting all these authors. So meeting all these great authors when you had so much sort of trepidation about going into writing, was it actually helpful or was it daunting? Was it kind of like, oh my God, I've met Kundera now, how dare I write? What was that like?
It's true what you say about the balance between passion and work, and I always remember this sentence by Beethoven, the musician. He says, 10% of passion, but 90% of perspiration. Is that the English?
Yep.
Yes, of sweating. So that helped me, because even, if Beethoven himself says that. And it also helped me to meet those tremendous writers. Some of them are in this book, and you mentioned some of them, like Ahmed or John Le Carré, Milan Kundera, Imre Kertész. Why? Because they're really great. They're not in the middle. When people are in the middle, I sort of feel like they say, look at me, and you should recognize how good I am, I'm a genius, can't you see? But the others, they have nothing to prove, because they can be really themselves. If you put them in, if they are in confidence during the interview, if you get to know them well, because you've interviewed them once and then twice and then 3 times, and they like your work and they know that you write in an honest way, and you really try to find out what's within them. And that's it that really interests me. It's what is deep within them. Because, I think it's Picasso who said that once. He said, in every one of us, especially in artists, there's one trauma or one wound or one event that has taken place in their life, and that is going to be like, what's the word, Alice, in English? Something that really makes you... that
sort of propels you.
Propels you, exactly. And it will be there in almost all your books. And that's true. All books are variations on one single or maybe two ideas. And once I had a glimpse or the intuition of what it was, I like to read them, and then the conversation begins, and it's very open and free, and I hope intimate conversations that I want to reflect in this book, in aesthetics and intellectual life.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very interesting point. You know, with painting, it's something I've always noticed, and I'm sure you have noticed. You know, you can go to the great museums and you'd see these great painters who will paint the same subject over and over again. You know, nude reclining 37. Like, it wasn't enough that they already had reclined 36 times. They had to check it out as 37th time and see if they could get it right, because there's something they're obsessed with in that engagement, or whatever it might be. You know. In writing, we seem to have a very the opposite attitude. The whole critical apparatus of the writing industry and readers are trained to always look for, quote, originality. You know, we're always looking at books and saying, oh, but he did this before. It's okay for painters to do the same subject again and again. Why is it not okay for writers to come at the same subject, obviously not to repeat the same exact experience, but to tweak and bring out different shades of meaning that may have occurred. And the great writers really do have these obsessive themes that they come back to, and the best of them can make that theme new again. So speaking of which, I'm going to now turn to your own writing and start teasing out some obsessive themes like that.
Yes, very true, and what I wanted to add is not only an obsession, but it's an obsession combined with very often a fragility. And they, so to answer your question, I then discovered that these people were also, they had doubts, and they were fragile, and but they did it.
Yeah, it's I mean, to the extent I've had a chance to meet a lot of these writers at different stages as a student or in some other capacity. That's one of the things that always came through in conversation. You know, I've been lucky enough to meet quite a few writers who are very well known, like Michael Ondaatje or Jen Coetzee or many others. And what always comes through is they don't see themselves as these, quote, great masters who, in a sense, have, quote, figured it out, or is writing necessarily from a place of knowing. They are, the best of them are always writing from a place of doubt and exploration, including of the form. Like, they've written what, you know, we consider to be one of the great novels of our time, and they kind of feel like, I'm still figuring the form out, and I'm going to try this. You know, there's that element. So I've read your two books, The Gift and The Attachment, and let's talk about The Gift first, because that's the one that's been launched here and that's out in English, and The Attachment, which is her first novel, but
it's the second.
It's the second novel, which will be out in English next year. So in The Gift, it's basically a woman goes to meet this lawyer because it's a meeting about a bequest, family inheritance, and it triggers all these memories in this woman about her mother, who was manic depressive, and the sort of all these memories coming back of the woman as a child when she was 5 years old, 10 years old, and older, and then she becomes a mother herself with daughters to take care of, and she remembers how the mother's illness meant that she was in some ways neglected, not just by the mother, but also by the father, who was so, you know, preoccupied with taking care of the sick wife. But in the household, they never talked about, and in this story, in the household, the family never really talked about the illness explicitly in its terms. So they talked about a convalescent home, but not a psychiatric institute. And I think, you know, this phenomenon of a sense of shame about mental illness is something that a lot of people in South Asia would be able to relate to, because I think the culture has changed a lot, and people are less, I think, afraid of seeking help when they need it, or admitting if a family member has that kind of problem. But I also think it's, I don't know how it's in Pakistan, but certainly from Bangladesh I can say that it's also not something that is completely free of stigma yet. People do sometimes feel uneasy about it in owning it, you know, like my father's ill with, has a cardiac problem, is in the hospital, is something you can almost wear as a badge of pride or convenience depending on your personality and what purpose it will serve. But you wouldn't do that when my brother is in a mental asylum or in a psychiatric institute. So, but you know, we imagine France to be a place where the West to be a place where this is something that's been really overcome, and yet in your story that is a strong. You want to talk about that?
It's more and more accepted, I would say, and the magazine would do cover about bipolar disease being now like the illness of the century. Yes, but that is still to remain on the paper. But in people's minds, it's exactly as you said. You can say, I broke my leg, but you can hardly say, you know, I have bipolar disease. It's something that's really, even now, difficult to admit. And yet, it's there is like an epidemic, because since I wrote this book, I'm really surprised to realize how much, how many people it impacts. So when I go to literary festivals, for example, and then I sign a copy of my book, and the people say, especially women, they say, I've read it until 2 o'clock at night and I couldn't stop and I cried. But what is really amazing is that you said it, they said that to me, you said that it's inspired by the story of your own mother, but it's exactly the story of my mother, or it's exactly the story of my cousin, my aunt, etc., etc. So at least starting with a very personal and specific story, I hope it has a universal impact, because so many people are in fact confronted to depression in general, and manic depression sometimes. And what interested me in this novel is that it's seen from the point of view of the daughter. The daughter is in herself is not ill, but her mother is. And then she discovered that the mother of the mother was as well. This discovery she does during the book, slowly, and especially when she's at the lawyer's office. You know, normally you tend to remember your parts in a flash when you're on an analyst's couch. But she, in this situation, she realizes it when she's at the lawyer's for this gift. And she also realizes that it was like a family secret, and it's been completely covered up. And she begins to realize how much it has shaped her own life, her own way of behaving and looking at the world. Because when she was little, her mother, for example, used to disappear, as you said, to go to a psychiatric hospital, but nobody would mention it, and the child would think, oh my God, what happened? Why isn't she there? Is she ill? They used to say she's on a trip, but you know, children feel things, and she knows, my protagonist, she knows it's not true. So she got the sensation that all of a sudden, the mother could disappear. So what was safe suddenly became unsafe. What was easy and you know the easy life became something became anguish, sort of anguish. And that, I think, shaped the way she looks at the world. Something that's given to her can't be given forever, and something which is happy can become suddenly very unhappy. So she's herself very, what's the right word? Insecure because of that, I think. And the other thing that is important is that she investigates about the past of the mother, about the grandmother, and she gets the feeling that there is a kind of repetition from one generation to another. And the behavior of the past generations can shape us deeply, especially when there is a family secret. Not always, it's not necessary, but when there is one, it does. And so one of the themes of the novel is this kind of cycle that can go from one generation to another. And if it's a negative cycle, then how can we break it? That's one question. And another question, which is important to me, is because we were, especially in the West, we were brought up with the idea that free will is very important, or we are going to be successful and strong and we can decide what we are going to be. But it's not like that. I don't think so. We're very much shaped by our emotions, and sometimes emotions lead us to do things that are completely contrary to our rational, to reason. And there's also this generation thing. So for many reasons, free will is not. It's not the only key. It's not the only explanation at all. So I wanted to explore all the rest, which is in most cases hidden or unsaid.
So one of the things that I think is really wonderful about your work, and why I would recommend it to all of you is, well, first of all, it's less than 100 pages. You can't beat that. Anything else will eat up your time. But the other thing that's wonderful about it is, as you see, it's a multi-generational tale. There's a grandmother, there's a mother, the daughter who's telling the story, and she has daughters when we encounter her as the mature narrator. Typically, a multi-generational tale like this, it could easily become something like the Makioka sisters, or take whichever example from world literature you will, which is, like a 3-volume thing, or 800 pages of all these details. Instead, this book, the way it treats this very large story that is about generational transmission and both failures of that transmission, what gets passed on through the DNA and what gets passed on through practice, through culture. It's about all these complex notions about psychological problems, how we see that, and its philosophical implications about free will or lack of it, all done in a total of, what is it, about, I didn't count, 30 chapters in a 96-page novel. So the average chapter is only 2 or 3 pages. And they're just like these flashes, and the details are very spare but particular, and the narrative structure is very slim but very precise. And it sort of, pleases me immensely, because I think we're living at a time where a certain kind of what I consider to be overwriting is sort of over-celebrated as good writing. Good writing doesn't necessarily have to be, always dense with compound sentences that you can barely follow and going, way too much. I mean, when it's done right, it can be masterful. Javier Marias at his best can take a single moment and talk about it for 17 pages, where almost in a slow motion, everything is being parsed out on what it can mean. You can do that too. That would be the other extreme of when it's done well. But there is a middle ground with I don't want to name the writers, but a lot of writing which I'm sure you've encountered too, where I feel like it's neither here nor there. It's neither spare and precise enough, nor is it sort of deliberately voluminous and communicating something where the immersive experience itself becomes part of the feeling. But in this case, you have this very spare style that it reminds me a little bit of Italo Calvino in a way, who was very philosophical. He's treated very big themes, but very, quote, lightly, very sparingly. Your topic is different. It's much. The story is much more personal than that. But why this kind of a form? Why this method? Why not play out these scenes and make it into a 350-page blockbuster?
Thanks for Italo Calvino, whom I like very much. And he used to write for children as well. And when you were mentioning that I was too shy to go to the novel directly, and I came there step by step. One of my first steps was children's writing. And one of the things you discover when you write for children is that you have to go through the essential very quickly, because they have no patience. So you mustn't lose them as readers. Well, it's the same here. I really hope the story is gripping enough, because it has those this philosophical aspect, but it's very simple and it's a story, so it must be very gripping. And I hope it is.
You know, your other novel, The Attachment, is in a sense a rewriting of Nabokov's Lolita, in the sense that it's the story from the girl's point of view. I mean, it's not the actual Lolita and Humbert that's being retold from Lolita's point of view, but a relationship like that. It's a young woman, 17 years old, who is just starting college and falls in love with her professor. And that too, in many ways, has the same structure as this story. You know, someone else, her daughter, is discovering the story almost by accident through these letters that were just kind of, I think, stuck in a tin box or something in the kitchen or cupboard somewhere in the house. She chances upon it, discovers that from these letters she can gather that this mother had this important relationship with a man, not her father, and then she goes to the grandmother and the aunt and others to search for that story, and it comes out. What interested me there is, you know, the story is of course about, among other things, transgressive love. You know, it's a relationship with a 17-year-old and a married 50-something, also a student and a professor. So on multiple counts, you know, the parents are unhappy about it. People comment at them on the street when they see this quote odd couple walking down the street. And it's actually not a very terribly uncommon phenomenon. I mean, you do see it all around the world. You see men significantly older than the women they're with. And I'm not talking about the men you see in Bangkok with the women they're with. I'm talking about actual relationships where the man and the woman like each other and then they've actually fallen for each other. And there's always, you know, this sense that the woman is being exploited. And there's, of course, often that element of a power dynamic and the asymmetry of power in those relationships. And in most cases, do you want to talk about that?
Yes, in lots of cases, in lots of cases, the young woman goes to the older man because, or at least people think it's because he is a powerful man, or he has money, but it's none of this in that case. It's really love, and what interested me was what is the mechanism of attachment? Why is it that suddenly we fall for someone who was totally an unwilling target or an unwilling person to fall in love with? So how does this attachment work? And how about falling out of love? So it's the mechanism of falling in and falling out of love. And there again, like in The Gift, there is a very important scientific dimension. In each case, I do a lot of research here on bipolar disease and neurosciences, but mind you, the neurosciences, they have a lot to say about falling in and out of love. And there is a lot of knowledge which could be used by novelists today, scientific knowledge, and which...
Can that knowledge be used by lovers or would-be lovers as well?
Yes, absolutely, no, absolutely. And some people think it's not romantic to refer to science when you're talking about love, but I disagree totally. I think it's the source of new images, and it's very fresh for the mind, new metaphors, and that's why I really delved into this, because it's fairly new, and I hope to somehow bridge a gap between science and literature, even if I don't want science to be too heavy, and so it's just there underneath, and sometimes it goes like this, but I think it's a very interesting path to be explored for novelists as well.
I mean, when we were talking right before we got on stage, that was what I was asking Florence. In both her books, I see that there are so many metaphors that are derived from scientific knowledge or new knowledge of science, and you've already answered why that is. But especially speaking of neuroscience, and I myself am fascinated by that subject, and these days, the last few years, when I'm not reading fiction, I do read a lot of fiction, and within that I've been reading a lot of non-fiction about neuroscience, because I think some of the most exciting work or breakthroughs in science in our time is now happening in neuroscience. You know, even authors who write for popular readers like us, books, especially books like somebody like Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, it really sort of can revolutionize how we see how the mind works. And the novel at its best for the last 100 years, I think the modernism has been understood in many ways, but one of the ways that I think has not always been paid attention to is how much it was about how the mind or consciousness works. And those writers were doing it by intuition and observation, and we actually have the benefit of scientifically discovered and proven mechanisms of how the mind actually works. And it's wonderful the way you bring it into your writing.
And if I was not, I feel like if I were not doing it, then I would write a love story, just like that would not be so different in its pattern from Jane Austen or Gustave Flaubert. So writing a love story in 2014, I think you really have to incorporate and encompass this wide new range of knowledge, and it's really thrilling to do it.
And you know, I don't want to generalize too much about cultural characteristics, but to some extent, you know, they do exist. You know, the English novel sort of is often a novel of what's called manners. You know, novel of manners. It's sort of about the social setting is very important. And it's, in filmic terms, it's written almost always at the mid-distance. Like the shot is a middle distance, it's a drawing room scene, you're seeing people at that distance, and eventually you go to a more intimate place and discover something about them. Whereas the traditional Russian novel basically has, well, the Russian novel has many strands. You know, there's Tolstoy, there's Dostoevsky, there's Gogol, and it's hard to make sense of what they do, but there's always this sort of tortured quality at the core of it. The French, I've always felt, and I was a student of French among other things. I studied French literature, both as a student just growing up, reading it in translation, and then studied French in university. And what appealed to me about French was the French sort of had the most analytical approach, and that's sort of the French philosophical tradition as well. And what you're doing is sort of a contradiction, because you, on the one hand, bring this very analytical approach to your writing. You know, in an English novel, you would not get this kind of treatment very commonly, where it's very spare, it's light. There's a lot of philosophy and science there, but it's not so sort of over the top that it feels burdensome. There's this mainly a story and characters, but there's a very analytical approach to the issues of these characters and everybody, which in the Anglo-American tradition we feel is almost contrary to writing genuinely or romantically or with inspiration, but you do the opposite.
But I think you can combine both.
Yeah.
It's true that this love story you're talking about, I sort of put it under a microscope and see it from a very close distance. But at the same time, there is a real narrative, and it's all supported by a real story. You want to discover who was this man the mother was madly in love with, and at the end you do discover him, and you do get to know him. It's just that he's not exactly the same as what she had imagined. So it's a bit of a combination.
There's a real sort of suspense to it.
Yes.
You know, you write about transgressive love or love that has been transgressed or fallen apart somehow. I mean, can love be really love if there isn't an element of transgression in it? Haha!
That's a tough one. What do you think?
It's actually like I ask the questions, I don't answer it.
Well, you see,
especially in the context of the attachment. And in the way love is conceived in that story.
Transgression or reprobation or something that society not in tune with, that's the kind of thing that interests me. But in my third novel, the one I'm working on now, I'm going even further than this, because it's erotomania I'm trying to explore, and I don't know whether lots of you know what it is. It's a real psychic disease this time. It's not like love, which can also be compared to a disease, but it's a real one. And it's when someone falls in love, usually with a celebrity, and they are obsessed by him or her, and they are convinced, but utterly convinced, that the celebrity is in love with them. So again, I was interested in finding out what's wrong with the mechanism of this obsessive thought that can totally ruin their lives, because it goes on forever and they harass the etc., etc. So I'm interviewing lots of neuroscientists to find out what's going on in the brain. Someone did this already, the same theme, but from another angle, and we discussed it together recently. It's Ian McEwan, and in a beautiful novel called Enduring Love. So when I said earlier that I was very interested in mixing or bridging the gap between science and literature, I'm not saying at all that I'm the first one to do it, of course, and I think people like McEwan or this American writer called Richard Paris, who really does very interesting things, or a younger one, James Flint, a British one. But they remain quite few.
It's interesting that you mentioned Ian McEwan, because I think he gives a good example of the intuitive approach and to the topic of transgressive love in a novel like The Comfort of Strangers,
yes,
which is one of my personal all-time favorite small novels. And then he revisits that theme in Enduring Love in a more expansive manner, and this time, as you said, with this sort of research knowledge about the dysfunction, whereas his early books, The Cement Garden, The Comfort of Strangers, they go to that from that intuitive place of trying to understand what human nature is like and how far it can go, and driven by obsessions or driven by passions. Speaking of that, so much of literature is not as such about, quote, normal people or normal life, Even the works that we think are about normal people, the writers who pretend or hope or aspire to write about, quote, normal people in normal circumstances. In entirely normal circumstances, it would be very hard to have a story. Pretty much you need something bad happening to someone before you start getting a story. And so all of literature is actually full of transgressions, if not just of love, but then transgressions of other kind and of violence. And so I was also wondering, looking at your book again and thinking about them, that not only is it a question of whether love can exist or love can be intense without that element of transgression, not just how society sees it, but how it is in our minds, but also, is transgression necessary to the narrative form? Like, can you have a narrative without, or a narrative that is intense enough? Any thoughts on that? And from all the writers you've read and met?
Well, as I said earlier, it's funny to discover after I wrote this book, the number of people who came to me saying, it's my story, or it's my mother's story, how could you describe it like this? So in this case, it's totally not normal situation, which in fact relates to many people, much more than I would have thought. And in the case of slightly abnormal love stories, it's about the same. So I'm not quite sure what normality is. I think there is some element of madness in each of us. It's just when you go deep down into the analysis of people and you get to know them better, that you discover that there is an element or an aspect which is just not what we call normality. And I think it's there. It's just for the writer to reveal it and show it, and maybe make it bigger than it is, just so that the reader understands the mechanism of it. But no, if normality was there everywhere, then it would be so boring.
Well, on that note, I think it'd be great to open up to the audience and take questions from you. Is there anyone with a question? And you can feel free to ask, because I know that her book is not available yet, so it doesn't have to be a question about her book. You can ask her anything about writing and about your favorite writers, because she's probably met all of them. Yeah, please go ahead.
When will the book be available?
Well, I think it's available now at this fest, but I don't know that it was in this market before then.
These two ones are available. They're here.
Is there any sample available to the gifts?
Sorry?
Is there any sample at the moment? Is there any sample available?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
At the bookstore, yeah.
There are many of them. Yes, it's there. It's available in English.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I found your story, your real life story, very inspirational, because I started off as an analyst and I've been banking, so I sort of understand that the view that you had sometimes when ego is not very meaningful. But how did you sort of get there? That you found what you were very passionate about, and then you started going towards it. Because I think there are a lot of people like that every day who are doing things that they're not very passionate about. How do you find that?
I'm not sure I quite got the question. How do you
move from something that you're doing?
Yes.
Not necessarily, find great inspiration, and then move towards something that you do find passionate and like living in.
How do you move from something that you're doing to writing a book about it? No, it's not that.
How do you go from doing an ordinary...
I'm sorry.
If I may just repeat it for you. Like, how do you go from doing something like business, as you were doing,
yes,
to finding out what you really want to do and then making that move?
Oh, I see. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. I must be a bit tired by the No, I really got convinced that it was not enough. It would not be fulfilling for the rest of my life. So it was an urgent need of trying to find a path towards something different. And I think I had this inner urge also to do something more creative. So I haven't been particularly courageous or brave, it was in me, and I felt that I had to follow this urge. So now, how did I do it? That I'm going to tell you how I did it. I was working for this American corporation, and I said to myself, what do I really want to do? I want to do something in culture. It can be, and probably about something related to writing and literature. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to try and be hired by a press group, a corporation that did newspapers. But they wanted someone in finance. And I said, okay, I can do that. I can do mid-term and long-term plans and strategic things. I can do that, but only for 2 years. And after 2 years, if you're happy with my work, there's something I would really want to do. Is I want to jump from the financial sector to the people who write. I want to become a journalist. So they stared at me and they thought I was completely crazy and a lunatic. But if that's really what she wants, let's say yes. In any case, this is going to happen within 2 years, and now we need her to do our financial plans. So, and within 2 years, she will probably have changed her mind. But it wasn't the case. 2 years later, I said, hey, you remember, now I want to be a journalist. And they said, well, if that's really what you want to do, then we're not going to consider your diplomas or everything, and you have to start from scratch, and your salary will be divided by 2. I said, Okay, fine. That's fair enough. And this is how I started a new life. And then from journalism, I began to write, first for children, as I said, and then I did a biography of someone who had a very romanesque life, so it was sort of a way of approaching the novel itself. And then I was pushed by my publisher, who said, now you have to try. You have to jump into the swimming pool and swim.
Would you tell the story of your first interview? Because
which one?
I forget the first writer that you went to interview and you weren't prepared at all, as in you hadn't written before.
The first
Can
writer.
you talk about it in either the introduction or in the interview?
Yes. Or was it? Are you mentioning the Borges? No.
Maybe. Well, never mind. We'll look for it later. But
Yes.
Any other questions? Yeah, in the back, please.
So, speaking of the obsessive notion that you were talking about, like how an individual can get obsessed with a celebrity or an individual, and that sort of you define it as a disease. So, my question being that you then mentioned about that you interviewed a few neurologists and you went into the medical aspect of it. But don't you think a lot of these diseases, so-called diseases, are sort of derived with your past experiences, and they sort of form that kind of obsessiveness that comes. So does your novel or does your research sort of distinguishes between the bio and the psychodynamic approach?
Between
the past experiences you've had, which sort of forms or is a cause for that behavior you might have when you grow up?
Do I think that this obsessive, I'm not sure. I got totally right. I'm sorry again.
Okay, so I'm talking about the distinguish, like making a distinction between the medical approach and the psychodynamic approach, which you sort of the past experiences you had, because neurologist is more medical, very scientific.
No, it's a combination of the two. In fact. It's so. For example, in my third novel, I'm interviewing psychoanalysts and neuroscientists because they usually don't talk to each other, and they think that their fields are completely separate. I don't know. I have no scientific knowledge to say that, but my intuition is that there should be links between the two. And this is what I'm trying to explore through words and images and metaphors. I don't know whether this really answers your question.
Yeah.
Any more questions? I think we're out of time actually, but Florence will be at the bookstore for signing and she will also be around. So if you want to come up and talk to her, I'm sure she'll be happy to do so.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you everyone.